After a long, long wait, Rachel Reeves' budget is finally here. We will dive into the small print, the words and the numbers on this latest episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it is Chris at Westminster.
And because nothing goes to plan, more on that later on Budget Day, the other half of the Newscast crew are actually not here yet. So we will be joined by Dharshini David, Deputy Economics Editor here at the BBC, and Ben Chu from BBC Verify at some point. So if you see them stumbling in or tripping over a cable or clearing their throats or downing a cup of tea, that is what's happening. They're not here yet. Now, Chris, that's people who are being late on Budget Day. But actually, the big thing before Budget Day was somebody being early. The Office for Budget Responsibility being spectacularly early.
It is an unbelievable start to the sort of Budget Day. Because the thing is with Budget Day, for newscasters who may have, cast an eye in the direction of Budget Day over the years, there's a choreography. There is a predictability. And it usually begins at around about 11:15 in the morning, when the Chancellor and her team of Treasury Ministers come out onto the steps of number 11 Downing Street and they hold up the red box. That a nod to a moment in history rather a while ago where a Chancellor managed to get to the dispatch box to the House of Commons without actually the copy of the speech they were going to read out. So it became a thing that you hold up the red box to prove that you've not forgotten it. Anyway, so she was doing all of that, and then you're going to the House of Commons, and then there's Prime Minister's Questions, which is a bit of a sideshow on Budget Day, and then at about 12:30, the Chancellor stands up and delivers the budget for about an hour. And usually, even if plenty of it, like this year, has been briefed or leaked in advance, you find stuff out as she is delivering it. Big twist this time. This document, for those who are watching and for newscasters who are listening, I will describe it. The Office for Budget Responsibility's Economic and Fiscal Outlook for November 2025. This document ended up on the internet about 2 hours early. So someone somewhere pressed publish by accident, and my goodness, they must, you've got to feel sorry for them on a human level tonight. So this popped up. And because the Office for Budget Responsibility, the forecaster and the watchdog, crunches all the numbers around the budget, well, everything's in it. So there we were.
It's a big giveaway.
Well, it's the entire thing. The entire thing. So there I was on Politics Live with Vicky Young and Faisal Islam and the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And, we were doing the whole, well, this will probably be in it and this might be in it. And let's see what she says about that. And then suddenly we're able to plough through it. So, Helen Miller of the IFS is saying, crikey, this is extraordinary. So is Faisal, so am I. We're reading out chunks of the budget before Rachel Reeves has even done it, and it wasn't her fault. It wasn't the Chancellor's fault. It was a cock up at the IFS, and I should say the Office for Budget Responsibility took responsibility for the foul up and said, look, we mucked it up.
I always say the light blue book, which is the book that the OBR produces, always at least as interesting as the red book, which is the budget itself. And they took it very literally today. And also the OBR say that they're doing a review into how it happened. And Richard Hughes, who's the boss of the Office of Budget Responsibility, says he serves at the pleasure of the Chancellor and the Treasury Select Committee in Parliament. And he says if he loses the confidence of either of them, then he would have to do what they tell him to do. Right. The other half of the Newscast crew is getting here. Dharshini David is sitting down. Ben Chu is sitting down. They're getting their microphones in place. Guys, we were just doing the last-minute plot twist about the OBR kind of letting the entire budget out of the bag in advance, so you guys don't need to cover that. Unless, Dharshini, you just want to give us a sort of facial expression for how you reacted when that happened?
Do you know how the rest of the world probably went, oh my God, tax rises? I just went, an extra hour and a bit to actually
read, because you got it in front of you. They're both hefty documents.
Yeah.
Right, let's get into the details then of what's in the budget. We've got quite a lot of time, so we can just chat through what we think of it. You don't have to do headlines and sort of boil it down into one thing. But if there was a big thing that jumped out at you from all these numbers, all these policies, all these decisions, Ben, what would you say is your kind of one first big thing?
Well, I suppose it's £26.1 billion in tax increases, which is what she's put in for 2029-30. We knew there were going to be big tax increases in this budget. We were all writing about it and anticipating it for weeks and weeks, if not months. So for me, it's kind of seeing that figure in black and white. And
Because it's a big number.
It's a big number. I mean, it's not quite as big as her one last year, but you put the two budgets together and it's pretty large, as Dharshini's been pointing out, in historical terms. So just seeing that figure, seeing the breakdown of it, exactly what she's raised and what she hasn't raised, which is just as interesting. And yeah, that's what I've been looking at today, how she has, as they say, plucked the goose. That's what they say. You need to pluck the goose with the least amount of squawking. That's how you do tax policy.
Yeah.
And so how she's gone about doing that is key for me.
The thing is, on that point though, and hello to you both. This gets to the crux of it, doesn't it? With an element of this, or the choice to do something of the, what was described in advance as the smorgasbord. But to take that plucking the goose thing a step further, there's maybe some of the smaller feathers, but rather a lot of the feathers being plucked, which might mean lots of people, lots of the goose saying ouch lots of times.
And also some of the feathers are going to be plucked in 2029.
Well,
And so it's you're going to be taxed potentially on a pay rise you get in 5 years' time as a result of this budget.
but the timing of that is really interesting, because I thought if you looked at the shape of today's budget, and as Ben says, we were braced for tax rises, right? But she was trying to please everyone. She was trying to please the markets by saying, look, I'm doing this. I'm being serious about raising money to make sure I meet the fiscal rules. She's trying to keep her backbenchers happy. And you could see that within that fact that welfare spending is going to be £16 billion higher in 2030 than previously thought, right? And in the middle of all of this, you're thinking, as you say, a lot of this is what we call backloaded towards the end of the forecast period. What does that mean? When you see not just the bulk of these tax rises in households, but also the squeeze on spending, which is built into this as well, it's as you're getting up to the next election. So they're going to revisit this, really.
Well, here's my format of everyone saying one big thing to start us off has gone out the window already. We're now very much into the meat and drink of the budget.
Well, that was my big thing.
Yeah, well, and a very big thing it was too. Chris, you don't get to do a big thing. We're just going to go into the details now. Chris, that point that Ben made about where and when taxes are rising, what's your political take on the formula that Rachel Reeves has landed on?
So the two things I would mention. So firstly, this decision to maintain the freeze on the thresholds of income tax, just to unpack that. So she hasn't touched the rates, she hasn't raised the rates, but she is leaving the thresholds in the same place in the years ahead, quite a few years ahead. Over time, with inflation and pay rises, that means more people cross the various thresholds, either start paying income tax or start paying on some of their income a higher rate of income tax. In other words, more people paying more income tax, which is what happens when you put up the rates as well. The difference being that the rates was the specific promise not to touch in the manifesto, that the thresholds weren't. As you were mentioning, Adam, it's a bit down the track. It's rather close to the next election. A year ago, she was talking about unfreezing them down the track. Now they're being frozen again down the track. In other words, when stuff is down the track, who knows what happens between now and the point where they're due to kick in. And then the other thing I would just mention in terms of the sort of revenue raising side of it, and this is heading into your territory, Dharshini, but I'm just struck by it in terms of the argument that the Chancellor was making, was the idea around limiting the capacity for salary sacrifice when it comes to pension savings with a tax beneficiary, as that money is on its way in to a pension pot. And in the round, to make a very short big point, the Chancellor trying to make an argument in the round that this is a sort of, as she would see it, a proudly and defiantly Labour budget, putting up taxes for a purpose, she would argue, whether that be taking children out of poverty or helping with energy bills, etc.
Yeah, and just to put some numbers on what you were saying there, Chris, the freeze on the income tax and the national insurance thresholds is by far the biggest revenue-raising measure. That will raise more than £12 billion a year by 2030. And the second biggest one is the reducing the tax relief on pension contributions done through salary sacrifice. That's £2.5 billion. Dharshini, what do you make about where the tax burden is going to be? Because, I mean, historically, we're now facing the highest tax burden the country's ever had in terms of the number of pennies in every pound that is spent on tax.
Yeah, we sound like a broken record, don't we? We keep saying this, and yet it's going up to a new historic high, 38 pence in the pound by 2031. That, of course, is still moderate when you look at other wealthy countries. We've got to remember that ours has gone up, but we're still not at those kind of heights. And you have to consider who this burden is falling on, right? Now, if you'd put up rates of income tax, broken the manifesto pledge, it would have been more progressive, by which, of course, we mean that those on higher incomes pay more of their proportionately more of the tax.
Yeah.
But having said that, when you look at what she has done here in terms of fiscal drag, salary sacrifice, and also not so much of an earner, but could have an impact on behaviour, that mansion tax as well. It's very much targeting those towards the upper end, and particularly regionally London and the South East as well.
And what have we learned about how this so-called mansion tax is going to work? Of course, they don't call it that officially in the Treasury, do they? It's called the High Value Council Tax Surcharge or something like that.
Yes, because you can live in a property if you live in Kensington, which of course is a flat, and still be... I mean, to be honest, we're going to have a re-evaluation. To be honest, I've not managed to look through the details.
Fair enough.
Kind of day, but
and also it's not straight away, because
No, it's not straight-
it's another one of these
exactly.
measures. It'll take a little.
It takes
So the
time.
salary sacrifice thing is in a couple of years' time to give people time to plan, and also for companies to work out what they're going to do with people's pay package.
Totally. And, with all these things as well, they're sort of saying it's going to take time because we need to figure it out. Now, the mansion tax one's interesting because revaluation means that, it opens the door for further measures, right? Once you know how much those homes are worth. Sorry, Ben.
No, I was just going to say, I've just looked up the table for how this will work. And there's been some criticism of the mansion tax, as it's called, design, because it's basically a slab system, which economists absolutely hate. Because
Nothing to do with patios.
Not on patios. Slabs as in it goes up by a big step every time you cross a certain threshold. So if your value of your house is worth between 2 and 2.5 million, you will pay £2,500 a year. But then you go between 2.5 million and 3.5 million, it suddenly jumps to £3,500 a year. And if you go up above 3.5 million, between that and 5 million, it's £5,000 a year. And anything above £5 million a year is £7,500. So that's how she raises, or is projected to raise, about £400 million. But the argument of people like Paul Johnson and Dan Needle of Tax Policy Associates is a very, very unwise way to design a system, because everyone wants to be just below the threshold so they don't have that big jump in the costs, and they will fight tooth and nail to make sure their house is valued just below it.
Although some
putting
people might say
metrics out.
having a £2.9 million house is a nice problem to have. Chris, at the other end of the income scale, so this income tax threshold freeze, which we keep talking about, means that at the end of this decade, if you're earning £12,569, you currently do not pay any income tax. If you then get a very small pay rise in a few years' time, and that takes you over the threshold, so you start paying some income tax for the first time. How is that compatible with Rachel Reeves saying the people with the broadest shoulders are carrying the biggest burden here? If somebody on a very low income is going to start paying income tax as a result of this budget.
And I think that will be an element of the critique that she will hear as people move beyond their kind of headline criticisms of day one in the coming days, because for the person you described there, they are of very modest means. They'll suddenly be paying income tax, and doing so when the government is also making an argument around the case for removing the two-child cap on benefits. Now, there's an argument the government makes around lifting significant numbers of children out of poverty by doing so, but you can see an argument already being sharpened, particularly to the government's right from the Conservatives and Reform, that says that this is punishing work at a time where you're increasing the benefits bill. And the context of the two-child cap being removed is the government's failure, at least at the first attempt to reduce the scale of increase in the wider benefits bill. You'll remember that whole row back in the summer. So, you can hear that argument, I think, gathering something of a head of steam. The government's counter argument, or at least part of it, I'm just flicking between my books here, because I'm going to try and find the page in the red book, which is the government's budget book.
Give us some sound effects, flicking sound effects, please.
Here we are. Here it is for those who might be watching, and then this is where I try and... Oh, yeah, here's a fact that I've just stumbled on whilst I was looking for the thing that I'm actually looking for. The removal of the two-child limit will lift, so says the government, 450,000 children out of poverty. The thing that I was looking for, and I'm now obviously just going to...
Do you know what? Why don't you try and find it, and then because actually I was going to ask Dharshini to just expand on the point you made at the start about the increasing benefits bill.
Oh, I found it.
Hang on. Okay, Dharshini,
Sorry.
pause that thought.
Sorry.
Chris, restart your thought.
Page 33. Just to take on that argument, just so we present in the round that the whole nature of the kind of critique, if you like, that you put to me and some of the government's critics will put to it around the whole business of the thresholds. But looking at it in the round, page 33 of the Red Book, the government says that on average, all but the richest 10% of households will benefit as a percentage of income from overall policy decisions in 2028-29. In other words, the counter to the argument on the sort of quote unquote broadest shoulders is that the richest 10% of households will be the ones that take that hit.
Dharshini, back to you. You were going to make your point about the increasing welfare bill.
Increasing welfare bill. This is a fascinating one, isn't it? Because we already know that, your friends, the OBR, or maybe not our friends after today because they're leakers and the rest of it. But
mistaken publishers. Anyway.
People with overactive fingers. They put out a report earlier in the year, their long-term sort of fiscal risk thing, and they did a whole bit about, the ballooning cost of triple lock in particular, and how that's going to rise by about 50% relative to GDP in the coming decades, right? And we know that a lot of these things are adding up over the years. And when you look at this, that struck me today when they talked about the fact that actually one of the big changes here was that you're going to see a welfare bill that was £16 billion higher. Now, we know, for example, about the lifting of that cap on people with more than 2 children. Also the U-turns as well, but also
winter fuel and reforming personal independence payments.
Totally. And on top of that, there is also the fact that they've had to pay more to uprate benefits, both working age and pensioner benefits, than they
keep pace
assumed.
with inflation. Yeah.
So they keep, or keep with triple lock, keep pace with average earnings, which is above inflation, of course, and has been. And on top of that as well, you've got a rise in the number of disability claims. And on top of that, you've also got higher unemployment than the OBR had assumed. So all of that adds up. And it just underscores the challenges the Chancellor is going to face. The pressure she's under in terms of reforming welfare and getting a grip on that bill and making sure it doesn't keep outpacing the rate at which the economy is growing, for example. But on the other hand as well, the challenges she is going to face when she tries to do that, because she tells us she is going to try and do this.
But Ben, there's one thing where, there's a few things where the Treasury is getting kudos from economists, but one thing where the economists are saying, you finally got a grip of a problem that's coming down the track, is replacing the money they get from fuel duty from petrol and diesel vehicles with an alternative that you can get from electric vehicles. And the Treasury has started the process of making that switch in the public finances today, a switch that people say has been long in the making.
Yeah, I've been writing and broadcasting about this issue for a very long time. The UK government gets about £24 billion a year from fuel duty. It's a pretty significant tax take. But as you said, Adam, if we move to electric vehicles, they're not going to be putting petrol in their cars, so they won't be paying any fuel duty at all. And if the government rolls out EVs, as it hopes to do over the next decades, then petrol duty revenues will go to virtually zero. And that's why some of these charts of future government borrowing are so alarming, because all that fuel duty is just assumed to disappear. So that's exactly why you need to have a scheme in place to replace it, get money from motorists. And the EV mileage charge that they've announced today is a start. It's not the end of it by any means, because they'd need to properly reconfigure the whole system to get as much in as they're currently getting. But it is a start, and you're right. In a sort of pretty desolate landscape of criticism from tax economists, this is one where they have given a thumbs up and said thank you for at least starting to grasp that nettle.
And Chris, because I get to sit in the podcast studio reading things all day rather than being on every news broadcast going like you have, it means I've had time to read the consultation about how this new electric vehicle road tax might work. And it's like reading a document from the future. Basically, when you buy an EV in a few years' time, you will have to estimate at the start of the year how many miles or kilometres you think you're going to drive, and that might vary depending on if you've got a full EV or a hybrid. Then you will pay a monthly charge for how much DVLA thinks you're going to drive. Then at the end of the year, you'll sort of have to do like a vehicle tax return where you either pay more or get money back because you've driven more or less than you thought you would. And you will even have a situation where when you buy your new electric vehicle, you could buy your miles in advance in the garage.
All of which, what's interesting about this, I mean, clearly the government and previous governments have wrestled with for a while with this whole conundrum, as Ben was saying, which is that, as people transition from petrol and diesel cars to electric ones, the whole business of your revenue stream from fuel duty starts to go down and down and down. So how do you take that on whilst also trying to incentivise people to make the switch? What intrigues me hearing your reading this afternoon is that sounds like a bit of a faff. So you just wonder how that can be, given that at the moment when you fill your car up with petrol, you pay, my goodness, you pay a lot in fuel duty, but as a proportion of your fuel bill, et cetera, et cetera. But there isn't a additional administrative cost, is there? You just pay it when you pay for your petrol.
It's reminiscent of the mansion tax we were talking about. It's quite a lot of effort to deliver. Darshini, here's a real economicsy thing for you. The headroom. So basically, the gap between what Rachel Reeves is going to do and what her self-imposed fiscal rules would allow her to do in terms of taxing and borrowing, she has increased that gap.
She has increased that. And this is one way she's trying to play to the markets, right? Sort of say, look, I'm a credible chancellor with a credible plan. And I'm going to increase the headroom. And we had seen that shrink, hadn't we? Not just under Rachel Reeves, but also under Jeremy Hunt as well. It has been smaller than it had been sometimes in the past, often in the past. And therefore, as a result, that's part of the reason why we'd seen those heightened nerves in the gilts market, which in turn has led to perhaps elevated borrowing costs for the Chancellor. She's trying to calm things down. And, looking at the market reaction, we saw quite a market reaction, by the way, when we had that leak of the OBR book to start with. And it's quite extraordinary what happened to gilt yields, the return on gilts.
What did happen?
There was kind of a dip and then up again. Yes, a bit of a seesaw. And I think you could see a little bit of relief going through them, thinking, actually, this is not nearly as bad as we had feared. And she has increased that headroom. And that is almost kind of like a quality assurance stamp. Having said that, as you full well know, every time we look at these numbers, there's a lot of uncertainty around what is actually going to happen particularly when it comes to raising these tax revenues. Particularly you've got a smorgasbord as well. You're not quite sure how that's going to slip down at the end of the day. And so, the OBR are still saying, actually, when you look at the chances of meeting the fiscal rules, it's not ironclad by any means.
I think that's a really key point, Adam. The criticism of the smorgasbord, there are many criticisms, but one of them is
this idea that she's done lots and lots of things as opposed to just increasing income tax for everybody.
Yeah.
Is that we've seen in the past that chancellors have tried to do little things here and there. Do you remember the pasty tax from George Osborne? Philip Hammond tried to put up a tax on the self-employed to equalise. It was a very sensible tax reform in many ways, but he basically had to reverse. George Osborne had to reverse. And when you do small things, you get a lobby that comes out and says, this is outrageous, you have to... And chancellors have shown that they sometimes reverse course on it. Whereas if you do a big, broad-based tax increase, for instance, George Osborne putting up VAT quite significantly when he first came in, or previous chancellors many years ago now, but just putting up
national insurance,
or income tax on everyone. It's much harder when everyone's suffering to sort of to have a real lobby against it. There's complaints, but they don't unravel as much. The issue, and I think as Dharshini says, the OBR has flagged this, is if you're trying to do small things, it's less likely to stick. So yes, the bond markets reacted positively today. I was updating my screensaver, my browser to see what the markets were doing. It was positive. But let's keep an eye on that over the next few days, because if there is an unravelling, I think the markets could easily turn against it as well. And that's very dangerous for the Chancellor.
And also that'll be very obvious as well, because we'll be able to see a number. And also Rachel Reeves made it a salient thing because she said one of her goals with this budget is to reduce the cost of government borrowing. And so if it goes up in the next few days, that'll be a cross next to that goal.
I mean, to be fair, there's all sorts of reasons why gilt yields move, and the Chancellor always says, "Oh, it's not us, it's the others, it's the rest of the world." And there's a heightened, and there is a fair point that there has been sort of heightened anxiety, but when you look at our level of our debt compared to our size of our economy, we are up there in a league table we don't want to be, quite honestly. So when we look at these numbers, it's not just about, are things going to unravel, but how reliable are some things? I mean, even fiscal drag, right? It depends on how fast inflation's going up, how fast wages are going up in the next few years, whether or not you get the money you're hoping for.
And actually, the sort of quotes good news for the government in these OBR documents is that they actually got more money in tax than they were expecting this year, because inflation and wages were higher than people expected. Chris, just to talk about the politics, I mean, Ben was talking about groups of people potentially being annoyed, but there's one very important group of people from Rachel Reeves' perspective tonight who seem very happy, and it's the Labour Party in the Parliament.
Yeah, at least for now. So I think it does seem to have gone down pretty well in the first instance from Labour MPs. The way I've been thinking of it this afternoon, for those who might have seen snapshots of the budget earlier, and this happens every time, which is why we should insert a little caveat here, is that when the Chancellor sits down, their own side sort of wildly cheers and waves the order papers around. And there was a lot of that from Labour MPs, as you would expect. What we'll need to see sort of metaphorically is, does that waving of the order papers carry on for the rest of this week, the rest of this month, not there's much of it left, next month and beyond? In other words, are Labour MPs reassured by what they've heard? Because they're really jittery at the moment, really jittery, because they can see the opinion polls, they can see how unpopular the government is, they can see how unpopular the Chancellor and the Prime Minister are, and they need something that firstly they believe in, and then secondly, because if you believe in it, it's a lot easier to sell, you can go out and sell. There is obviously then the question beyond that, which is that how does it go down when you're trying to sell it? But back to the point I was saying earlier, Adam, which is intriguing. So this was a proudly and defiantly Labour budget from a Labour Chancellor. That sounds kind of weird. You think, well, of course it would be. But I think the Chancellor's really lent into that and expressly lent into that because she knows she has to persuade her own side. The challenge she knows she will face is that even though this is a government with a mountainous majority, it won, as we frequently say on Newscast, on a very small share of the vote for a government winning in parliamentary terms by as much as it did, 33% of the vote. It's much, much lower than that now. So in other words, how much appetite in the country is there for that, if you like, defiantly, proudly, as they would see it, Labour budget? But yeah, they'll certainly hope, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, that it buys them some time, buys them some patience from their own side.
Also, Kemi Badenoch, leader of the Conservatives, she's bought herself some time with her party as well, because they seem to be giving her rave reviews for her response to Rachel Reeves, because of course on Budget Day it's the leader of the opposition that does the response rather than the Shadow Chancellor.
Yeah, I think, as Kemi Badenoch was telling the two of us on Newscast, a couple of weeks ago, Adam, she turned something of a corner in terms of her own approach to her appearances at the dispatch box. And rather than being, if you like, academic and pernickety with particular points, she has decided to kind of be more theatrical, almost pantomime-ish. And there was a panto element, actually, because she got all of her MPs saying, oh, well, what's going up? And then riffing through a few things that were going up and what's going down. And they're all shouting down, 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 etc., etc. And it seems quite, I don't know, cheap, arguably, some might see it as, but it's effective, that kind of thing, in the theatre of Parliament, because it means you can land a point that is easily understood on the television, the radio, in social media clips, that allows people to see what the thrust of your argument is. And she seemed to be really enjoying herself in the Commons today, Kemi Badenoch.
And she called Reeves and Starmer Laurel and Foolhardy, a joke I can't believe hasn't been used before in the House of Commons, but there you go. Now, I had a theory before the budget, just trying to be a little bit like countercultural and contrary, that actually rather than a lot of the budget measures, maybe what we'd be talking about is the state of the economy overall in the future. And I don't really feel that is the way the conversation's gone, but let me have it anyway, because if you dig into the OBR's projections, they've revised growth for the whole economy down for the next few years. I mean, the economy is projected to grow. It's not a recession. No. It's not flat, but it's not huge. And it is going to grow slightly less than people were expecting, even at the start of this year. Then if you look at another measure, which is this thing called real household disposable income, which in normal language is the amount of money the average household has left after they've paid all their taxes. Now, that was the new measure that Keir Starmer said was his target for success in this parliament. The OBR say that on average, that measure is going to grow by 0.25% per year for the next 4 years. That does not sound like stellar growth in how rich people feel, Dharshini.
Adam, just to give you compare and contrast, right? Do you remember cast your mind back to ancient history, the last parliament? And do you remember we were told then it was the worst parliament on record since the 1950s at least, when they started the figures for that particular metric, real household disposable income. That was an average of 0.2% per year, right? We're looking at the next few years. We're talking about an average of 0.25% per year.
So pretty much the same.
So only slightly better. And part of that is to do with the fact you say they downgraded the growth forecast, but also more money is going out of pockets and taxes. And also on top of that, when we talk about the cost of living help and the impact on inflation, it does make a notable difference next year, particularly when it comes to energy bills. After that, it really tails off. So, as far as households are concerned, as we get up to the next election, you may not be feeling it.
And it's funny, do you remember the 5 milestones that they announced? And one of them was, as you said, to have real household disposable income.
There were actually 6 milestones.
Was it 6?
Because one of the missions had 2 targets. Anyway,
okay.
carry on.
Well, anyway, one of them was to have it grow. And everyone said, well, that's incredibly easy, isn't it? Because it always grows over a parliament. This is the lowest bar that they could possibly have set themselves.
And they're only just crossing.
Well, they're crossing it, but it's not as impressive a crossing of it as it might have been. Look, I mean, in a way, this is predictable because it wasn't predicted to grow very fast in the previous forecast in March. And she's just whacked on a load of taxes and growth has been downgraded. So you can see why that's happening. But it does really underscore that actually perhaps they were pretty sensible to be very, very small c conservatives in that target. Because let's face it, the outlook over this parliament, despite the fact that they keep talking about we've got the fastest growth in the G7 at the start of this year, it's weak. It is weak and it's not changed since they came in, and it's really not changed much since the financial crisis.
And Chris, we should give a bite of the cherry to the other opposition parties in Parliament, because we do have multiple other parties contributing on budget day. So Nigel Farage, for example, Leader of Reform UK, he said that this budget was an assault on aspiration and saving. In other words, taking aim at those threshold freezes and also the limits on how much cash you'll be able to save in an ISA in a few years' time.
Yeah, the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey, for them was making an argument, and this is a familiar argument. They're really sort of doubling down on this, which is an argument around, look, if you really want economic growth, the UK needs a closer relationship with the European Union. They've talked about rejoining the customs union. They think that is a distinctive policy because plenty of other, certainly of the UK-wide or GB-wide parties are not advocating that. So that was the Liberal Democrat argument.
And the SNP, you can see they're getting ready for the Scottish Parliament elections next year by blaming every economic woe on decisions made by the Labour Party, because that's their main opponent in the Scottish Parliament elections next May.
And Plaid Cymru in Wales, also aware of those elections to the Senate, also happening in May, making an argument about what they feel is the historic kind of injustice as far as funding of Wales is concerned. And to mention the Green Party of England and Wales. Do you want to take them on, Adam?
Yeah, Zach Polanski, incredibly popular on social media with his videos, possibly getting even more popular with people today, saying actually what you need is a wealth tax, and that this mansion tax on some properties isn't going nearly far enough to target the richest people in the country. Right, thank you very much for targeting some great budget analysis here on Newscast, everyone. Before we go, though, Ben and Dharshini, maybe you don't know about this, but you know that we've sort of, Shania Twain is our sort of patron saint pop star on this podcast.
Absolutely.
Because she's a big fan of Chris Mason.
More to the point, I'm a big fan of hers.
Yeah, every day you can hear her in our Newscast opening music saying that she wants a tour of Downing Street from Chris Mason. Anyway, we've had a little bit of an update, not from Shania herself, but almost as good as. Here is a message we had from newscaster John, who said, "Hello, Adam, Chris and co. I'm currently on a cruise and was amazed to discover yesterday that the woman who is travelling as a fellow passenger with her dog is none other than Shania Twain."
Oh, fantastic.
So Shania, if you're listening to John, listening to this episode, which he's playing very loudly on his phone, you may think that's annoying on the cruise, but actually it's our chance of reaching out to you, Shania.
Well, I've got two questions. One is, what is the name of Shania Twain's dog? And the second one is, I didn't realise you could take dogs on a cruise.
No.
I think if you're Shania Twain, they probably you can take whatever you want. Shania, if you are listening to this on your cruise, I don't know if you're going past Antarctica or you're in the Caribbean or the Tasman Sea between New Zealand and Australia, because I believe you have a property in New Zealand, do let us know. My favourite bit about John's email, though, is he says at the end, it's Shania Twain of Newscast intro fame.
Oh, well,
I think she's actually famous for a few other things, John. But thank you for that too. Dharshini, thank you.
Thank you.
Ben, thank you.
Thank you.
And Chris, thanks for all your great reporting today and on Newscast.
Cheers, Adam.